Photography critiques are tricky. We might try and assess how much we like or dislike a piece of work based on our own understanding and our own experiences. We might even try and use an objective framework to describe art that at its core is a subjective product. We've all seen bad critiques where the reviewer focuses on irrelevant details because they've no context of the journey of the photographer or the goal of the work that they produce. How can we be better at that? Better at critiquing other people's work and better at critiquing our own? I've spent quite a lot of time diving through Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, learning about his wisdom on lighting and portraiture. But I thought I'd dig a bit deeper to find out what his approach to criticism was. Did people approach criticism differently 500 years ago? And did his advice stand the test of time? The foundation of a critique begins with taking a step back and acknowledging our own preferences and bias. The greatest deception people suffer is from their own opinions. Our own opinions are the direct result of our personality, our experiences, but our knowledge is limited, no matter how seasoned we think we are. For someone on the receiving end of a critique, Da Vinci says, while a person is painting, they ought not to shrink from hearing every opinion, therefore be curious to hear with patience the opinions of others. He says to listen to everyone's opinions, but there's a caveat. Consider and weigh well whether those who find fault have ground or not for blame. Now this is important. A great example are the comments on YouTube videos. Critical comments, even trolling comments, they're always worth listening to because something triggered that reaction. I've got to assess if the comments come from someone who knows what they're talking about. If not, then a reply isn't really worth my time. And it's the same with artwork and photography. I think we should have the character to listen to all opinions and the wisdom to filter which opinions to act on. And I don't mean just listen to people who say our work's great, but those who genuinely move our understanding in the direction that we want to head, even if those opinions are negative. Caution here though, with poor critics, their opinions can say more about themselves than the art that they're critiquing. I'll probably make another video about critiquing critics, and you can critique that idea in the comments. And of course, we all carry the baggage of our bias. If you showed me a good portrait photo and a good landscape photo, I'd be tempted to show preference toward the portrait because I love portraits and I spend every waking minute thinking about them. But preferences are not valid judgments. Preferences are fleeting and often without intentional reasoning. We can define criticism as an opinion backed by reasoning, and judgment is a criticism based on some predefined criteria. So with that in mind, we need criteria to assess photographs from a more objective viewpoint, perhaps with a helpful rubric to keep us on track, and Da Vinci can help us with that. Some original idea or some original viewpoint can go a long way to make a piece of work stand out. The painter will produce pictures of small merit if they take for their standard the pictures of others. This is Leonardo's prediction of the monotony that we see on Instagram. If we aim to create things that already exist in massive numbers, then our work's not going to get noticed. People will swipe straight past them. Even shiny new approaches to photography can have their pitfalls. Sometimes an idea can be new and exciting to the artist, but they're already a tired meme to the public. Avoid studies of which the result dies with the worker. This is great advice. He's basically saying we should avoid fads and fashions that won't last. Once you've lived through a few, you can see them coming. Selective colour, Gaudi high dynamic range photos, black and white for the sake of black and white, even peddling NFTs. Now that died fast. I guess this would include artistic dead ends or things that never get traction in the first place, or cliches we see over and over again. It's part of the learning process to go through these phases, which is good, but once we recognise them, we can reduce the time we spend on them in the future. Execution of an idea is the name of the game, but some technical knowledge is needed to pull it off, and it doesn't need to be deep knowledge. Jane Bone was known for her exceptional portraits despite her lack of technical interest in a camera. She had just enough knowledge to pull out the pictures that she needed. In a world of fancy techniques, basic competence is underrated. Competence and intentionality. Is the image sharp where you want it sharp? Is it bright where it needs to be bright? Are there any distractions that could have been avoided? Distractions are the downfall of any photograph. Unlike a painter who builds up from a blank canvas, photographers start with the messiness of the world and go about simplifying to pull out the message that they're searching for. They remove distractions at every stage of the process, when planning, when framing the shot, the timing of the shutter release, in editing, post-production, and even when they're presenting the photograph. It's easy for a critic to find fault in other people's work, and I think that's why we need them, because we can't see the errors in our own work. Errors are better recognised in the work of others than in our own, and that often while reproving little faults in others, you might ignore great ones in yourself. We're so emotionally connected to our work that we only see what we want to see. We might miss small errors or even huge ones if we don't get input from our peers and teachers. Ansel Adams said, "There's nothing worse than a sharp image of a fuzzy concept." So we can forgive a great deal of technical missteps if the ideas are powerful enough. Let's go there next. Da Vinci and Ansel Adams would have got on like a house on fire. Leonardo says that we should pre-visualize our ideas as an image and then execute the idea to the best of our technical abilities. First strive in drawing to represent your intention to the eye by expressive forms. And the idea originally formed in your imagination, then go on taking out or putting in until you've satisfied yourself. Nothing is left in the work which is not in harmony with reason and the effects in nature. And this will be the way to win honour in your art. A lot of images fail because the main subject isn't the main subject. He mentions harmony, and that's the interplay between the subject and the compositional elements that support it. You can feel the success of a composition at a subconscious level, but it's really about how the visual elements contribute to the goal of the image. Is it stable or dynamic? Are we guided to something important or left to explore the details? Though the composition of a picture can be easy to assess and discuss, the impact of the subject depends on who is looking at the image. So a critic should appreciate a range of viewpoints other than merely their own, especially if the image was made for a specific audience. It's a useful exercise to walk around in someone else's shoes when they're making observations, because how the pictures make us feel is the core of why they exist. I think you could take a mindless photograph and it would be worth looking at for someone, somewhere, but the odds are stacked against you. The painter who draws merely by practice and by eye without any reason is like a mirror which copies everything placed in front of it without being conscious of their existence. Da Vinci is saying we can't just make an arbitrary image and hope that someone finds value in it. Value needs to be part of why the image was created. A passion of the artist, a message, a memory, or even a way to showcase a particular skill, but it has to be made for a reason. Make your work carry out your purpose and meaning. The interpretation of a photograph's meaning can be in the hands of the artist or the viewer. Terry Barrett explains the differences in his book on criticising photographs. Intentionalism is when the photographer declares a meaning, and criticism is then based on whether that goal is reached. But sometimes the photographer doesn't make an interpretation, or they don't have one, or they change their mind over time. On the other hand, we decide that the interpretation belongs to the viewer, and the photographer's interpretation is just one of many interpretations. It's easier and more practical for the viewer to form the interpretation. The photographer is not permanently accessible for a discussion when you're looking at an image, and really, a picture should speak for itself. A viewer's interpretation is actually quite special because then they feel like they've contributed to the experience. The photograph belongs to them in some way. They've formed a connection, and that's one of the goals of art. The weight of the interpretation depends on the viewer. A critic should be aware that an image's meaning might be different for other people, even if they themselves are not favourably moved by it. A lot of judging and criticism happens with your nose pressed against the photograph, looking at the details and developing your thoughts over time. But there's something to be said about general impact, one that happens at a gut level, an instinct, and it happens both before and after the meat of criticism happens. In a room full of images, which one caught your eye on the way in? Which ones did you remember when having breakfast the next day? It could be one of the visual aspects, especially at first, but it could also be the meaning or lasting emotion that gets triggered. And this addresses the last problem for the critic. Our emotions or our views can change year to year, even hour to hour. The impact of a photograph can depend on the books we read last month, or the conversation we had with friends the night before, or what we had for breakfast that morning. There's a butterfly effect of millions of small things that can influence our moods and tastes. It's fickle. We are as subjective as the art that we're looking at, and it's another reason to take care with giving and receiving criticism. Lots of stars need to align, the right work in front of the right people at the right time. That's why the same piece of work might get trashed at one showing and praised at another. Barrett suggests that this can be avoided to some degree. Whether someone likes a photograph is not particularly relevant. What is relevant is whether or not someone thinks it's good or bad, and for what reasons. Like I mentioned earlier, just because we like something doesn't mean that the next person will, and we might dismiss an image that would move the next person to tears. Just like for scientists, it's often a good idea to separate objective observations, factual information, from subjective interpretations. It keeps things cleaner and more defendable. Da Vinci thought about how important it was to be critical of your own work and allow others to be critical of it too. It's all part of learning and growing. Figuring out who to listen to is a skill. Being critical of existing art so that you can improve your own is a skill. And the principles behind it haven't changed that much in hundreds of years.